Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 10, and we are going to be talking about interpersonal power in relationships today. And we've talked a lot about interpersonal communication and intercultural communication, but power in relationships and in communication is an integral part of understanding how to communicate effectively. And so I would like to introduce you to the concept of interpersonal power. And what are the things that come to mind when you think about the word power, the instances where power is used? For me, I tend to think of the education system, I tend to think of government, I tend to think of politicians, I tend to think of people in employment that have managerial positions or executive positions. And so I think that we often understand the concepts of power and what elements are involved in power in context, but I don't think we often consider power in communication and in relationships. So today we're going to focus on those things. So if we're looking at interpersonal power in relationships, interpersonal power is the ability to influence another person in the direction that you desire. And the easiest way to say that is to get another person to do what you want. And from early on, maybe even week one, we've talked about how communication, we have motivation to have our needs met and have our goals met. And I've talked about how that can be selfish if it's not balanced with other orientation. And so interpersonal power, which exists in any relationship, regardless of the status of the relationship, it is the ability, so it's actually how effective you are at influencing another person in the direction that you desire. And so you just want them to do what you are hoping for or seeking, and if you have interpersonal power, you will be able to influence them. Now, as the relationship develops, interactions reflect changes in power between partners. And so often a lot of the concepts we've talked about, as the relationship changes and the dynamic in the relationship shifts, the changes occur in those specific contexts. And so the power will change. So someone may have interpersonal power early on in the relationship, and as the relationship develops, it will switch and it can shift and it will change. And so there's not necessarily always one person in the highest level of power. That will go back and forth sometimes. And then there are certain relationships where one person will always have the interpersonal power in the communication or the relationship. And so it kind of depends, but please understand that as the relationship develops, the power dynamic does change. So let's look at 5 principles of interpersonal power. And these are basically ways to help you manage power. And that's not to say to gain power over someone, but to manage the power struggle or the power differential in the relationship. So the first one is, power exists in all interactions and relationships, even if your goal is just to get them to listen. And remember, we talked about how you have different roles. So one is the listener, one is the speaker, and then your feedback and your message and your channels and all of those things are designed to register if the other person is listening. And so at the most basic level, communication, there's a power struggle for getting the other person to listen, and that is usually shared. Most of the time, if you're in a conversation with somebody, both parties want the other person to listen to them and to be heard. So that's usually a shared power, but that is the first principle to manage power. The second is that power derives from an individual's ability to meet another person's needs. And so because that's a little bit abstract, I'm going to break that down a little further. In other words, the degree of satisfaction in the relationship represents the amount of power. And so basically what that's saying is, if you are extremely satisfied in a relationship, you have a satisfactory amount of power in that relationship according to your perception. Now, the other person may have a different perception of who has the power, but your degree of satisfaction is directly contingent upon the perceived amount of power that you have in the relationship. Now, in a dependent relationship, and that I know that tends to be more of a psychology or a counseling term, but I think you all kind of have a concept of dependency in relationships. When one person needs more than another, So you are more needy, you are more driven to have your needs met in the relationship. So that means consequently the other person has more power because they are able to either provide for your needs or to deny your needs. And so that gives them more power by default. Now, studies of couples show this, and I was curious, do you have specific examples that you might share either from yourself or from an acquaintance or a family member or a friend? Studies of couples show that this is true, that the degree of satisfaction represents the amount of power, and that when one person is needy, the other person tends to have more power in the relationship. So I'm curious if you had specific examples that you wanted to share in the post on that one. And then doing things you might not do usually to keep the relationship going. For example, if you had an example of where the person was consistently doing things that really were not something they would have normally done, but it was in an attempt to maintain the relationship because of the power differential, whatever that might have been. I'd love to hear some stories about that. And this is a very interesting concept. So I'm going to tell you number 2 again, just so you can get it in your head. Power derives from an individual's ability to meet another person's needs. How effective are you at meeting the other person's needs? If you are, then you have a lot of power in the relationship. When more people can meet the needs of that individual, the less power any one of them has. So if we go back to the dependency in relationships, if someone is dependent on only 1 or 2 people, then those 1 or 2 people are going to have a huge burden of meeting that need, which means they're going to have a huge amount of power in the relationship. If there are 20 or 30 or 100 people that can meet needs, then the less power any one of them is going to have in relationships with that individual. Okay, the third principle, both partners in an ongoing relationship have some degree of power. That seems pretty understandable and self-explanatory. But I'm curious if you have an example of a one-sided power balance. In other words, you're both going to have some degree of power, but that some degree of power might be very, very small. So I'm interested if you have any examples of a one-sided power balance. And that doesn't have to be a personal example. It can be anything you think of. Then an interdependent relationship. So remember, when we were talking about the power comes from an individual's ability to meet another person's needs, which that breeds dependent relationships. Now we're talking about interdependent relationships, which is mutual satisfaction of needs. So you are interdependent, meaning you rely on the other person, but you have other ways to have your needs met, not exclusively on that person. So an interdependent relationship is much more healthy. There's a mutual satisfaction of needs, which means both people have similar amounts of power. Because obviously, if you're both having your needs met and you're both interdependent with each other, then you're going to have a shared amount of power. The more intimate the relationship, the more needs are met by that partner, which again makes sense. I'm curious if you all think that there's a shift when you're dating, when that takes place. Is there a shift when all of a sudden your needs are being met more consistently by your partner? And what do you think that shift is during the dating process? And then principle number 4, power is circumstantial. So as needs change, power changes. So if certain needs disappear, that could mean the relationship may end. And I think it's been made into a song, and I think it's a scripture in the Bible, and there's a lot of talk about in everything there is a season. So there's a time to love and a time to hate and a time to live and a time to die and all those things. So if you think about that in the context of relationships, if you have a person in your life that is meeting a temporary need, that could be your venting person when you need to vent, or it could be somebody who is a great listener and you're going through a really rough time, and so you are taking advantage of the fact that they can listen to you and you can share what's going on, or someone you really, really trust and you're able to really be open and honest and get good, true feedback from them. So there are needs that we have that change throughout our life. And so sometimes you may not have a lot of power in that relationship because they're really truly meeting your needs. But if those needs disappear, there may be no further need for that relationship to continue. And it kind of seems, in the way that I'm describing it, it seems a little bit like, use them up and throw them away. And that's not a conscious decision that we make, and that's not something that we necessarily think through. But I'm sure you can think of times when you had someone in your life that served a purpose, and when that purpose was over, the relationship just kind of dissolved, or you just stopped hanging out as frequently, and then over the course of time you just didn't have contact anymore. And it's not to say that there was anything wrong with that dissolution, but that is something that happens if needs are no longer met. Okay, and finally, the fifth principle, relational development involves a negotiation of each partner's power. Let me say that again because it's a little bit meaty. Relational development, so as the relationship is growing and changing, that involves a negotiation of each partner's power. That's an ongoing negotiation. It is an ongoing shift. It's an ongoing change, ongoing evolution. So we decide who will have power over us. And sometimes we're not aware of that decision, and we don't think about that decision in relationships, but we do decide to give people power or not. And this can be stressful because, among other things, I'm sorry, that didn't come out right. This can be stressful because, among other things, it involves deciding what power to give up. So we have to be aware and be willing to give up certain elements of power. When you are in a relationship and when the relationship is developing and growing and changing, there are things that we have to compromise on. And so we will make decisions of what power we're willing to give up and what we aren't. Now, stability in a relationship, especially if it's a long-term relationship, occurs when partners reach an agreement about power distribution. And I don't want to communicate that you sit down and have a power distribution conversation, because that's not usually the way it works. Although sometimes very rigid, structured people may think that's the best approach. But most often, it just comes with the ebb and flow of relationships. Over time, you learn what's important to one person, what's important to the other, what you're willing to give up, what they're willing to give up, what you are deciding to give them power over you for, what they're deciding to give you power over them for. And so it just kind of evolves and grows as the relationship continues, and it's not necessarily a discussed or explicit type of conversation. It's usually more implied or implicit. So now that we've looked at the principles of how to manage power, I want to talk about the types of power in relationships. If you have a complementary power relationship, one partner dominates. And to be honest with you, that seems a little bit backward to me. Complementary seems to me that it would be working together or blending well or something like that. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to think about this. But if we think about a complementary power relationship, one partner is dominating, which means the other partner is the complement to that individual with the most power. So the focus is on one partner dominating, and then the other person is almost like an afterthought, if you will, as far as the power is concerned. Now, if you're in a symmetric power relationship, both of you want the same thing. There tends to be agreement, there tends to be consensus, there tends to be, working together toward a power balance. You both want the same things. Now, if you kind of think of symmetric as the broader category, then there are two co-symmetric power relationships that I want to look at. There's competitive symmetric, where both want control. So you both want the same thing, but you also both want control. And you can imagine what that would create in a relationship if you're both working toward the same things, but you both want to be in charge of that. So that is a competitive symmetric power relationship. Submissive symmetric is neither want control. So you both want the same thing, but you're both very passive, both very willing to defer to the other person, give them the control, give them the power. It doesn't really matter to you. And of course, that's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, but you can imagine what issues could come up with a submissive symmetric, because you both want the same thing.